Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Hello and welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. In Beyond the Call, 3 women on the front lines of Afghanistan, Emmy Award winner Eileen Rivers, an Army veteran who served in Kuwait and who's now an editor at USA Today, follows Sergeant Sheena Adams, Major Maria Rodriguez, and Captain Johanna Smoke, 3 soldiers who played crucial roles in intelligence gathering in Afghanistan as they worked to engage Afghan women in the effort to improve their lives and weaken the Taliban's hold on their country. Ms. Rivers' book is published by Da Capo, and I'm very pleased it brings her to our show now. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Leonard. I'm so happy to be here.
You begin your book with a brief history of women in the American military, beginning with the Revolutionary War and the story of Private Robert Shurtleff. Fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. I was so fascinated to learn her story as I was writing this book. I mean, it just shows how strong the call to serve can be in people, and that it doesn't really matter, the gender. At that time, she had to disguise herself as a male in order to fight, which was actually illegal. She practiced several times. She actually tried to enlist twice as a male before she succeeded as Robert Shurtleff. She kind of had to practice and kind of get being a male down properly in order to serve, and it took that much, and she still did it, and she was a great soldier.
Do we know how many women have disguised themselves as men to fight in our various wars?
That's a great question. I do know that there were plenty of women who tried, even during the Revolutionary War, and who were caught and who were imprisoned for it. So I don't know that there's an exact number. There were some women who weren't even found until they were, their bodies were found on the battlefield. And then it was discovered, oh, wait a minute, these were actually women. Deborah Sampson, as I mentioned, was an extraordinary soldier, and I think that's one of the things that saved her. She was outed, actually, when she was shot. She tried to dig the bullet out herself. This was a woman of amazing strength and character. She tried to dig the bullet out herself to avoid going to a doctor because she knew that if she went to a doctor, she'd be outed. And hygiene wasn't great back then. Her wound needed more attention, ended up getting infected. She ended up passing out. And then during the examination, the doctor found out she was a woman. She was sent back to her command with a note from the doctor telling her command that this man that you think of as Robert Shurtleff is actually a woman, and the commander couldn't actually believe it. He told her to go change her clothes out of the uniform, change into what she would normally wear, and then finally recognized her as Deborah Sampson and said, you could be court-martialed for this. You could be thrown in jail for this. But I won't do that because you are one of the best soldiers I have ever encountered. So she was that extraordinary.
But
really
still, you have to
story.
wonder about policies like that when somebody has worked so hard to fight for the cause and then gets punished for it. And then you go on to discuss the roles of women in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the shifting policies regarding women in the military throughout our country's history. Didn't women still have to fight to get good assignments when we went to war in Afghanistan?
Women had to fight the Fed is a perfect example of how women had to fight to really be on the ground who wanted to be. We were talking about Deborah Sampson fighting just to enlist in the military. And then we fast forward to a couple of hundred years later, and women are still fighting to a certain extent to try to get exactly what they want to get in the military. It kind of shows that legacy of strength and character and pushing the boundaries sort of continued on through to Iraq and Afghanistan. But yes, you're absolutely right. Women had to fight to be on the ground, female engagement team women. Sheena Adams, you mentioned her in your intro, is a great example of a woman who always wanted to be in combat since she was a little kid. Little boys dream of being in combat, and they, up until recently, knew that they would be able to get that opportunity. Little girls like Sheena Adams, who grew up dreaming of that same thing, really didn't get the chance until something like female engagement teams came along. And then in her particular case, she had to really fight to get on the team itself. She had been in the Marines before, had left, kind of trying to find herself, came back to enlist in the Marines again. And she had only been at her duty station for a little while. She hadn't been there for very long. She was a helicopter mechanic. And she heard about this group and really wanted to take the opportunity to do as much as she could with it. And so she fought really hard with her command to get in, to get on the ground. And then she became an incredible leader. She was one of the best female engagement team leaders that were out there, according to people who served with her. So, yeah, for a lot of women, it was a fight to get out there. And even after they got out there on FETS, there was still this struggle to say, hey, we're here, we care about our mission, give us the chance to really accomplish it in every way we possibly can.
And so we'll talk more about her later and the whole business of the Kevlar ceiling.
Right.
But I wonder what the situation for women in the military was like when you served in Kuwait.
Right. So when I served in Kuwait, I was an Arabic linguist in Kuwait. I went after Desert Storm, and there was really nothing like female engagement teams when I was in. I was in military intelligence. Women got opportunity in military intelligence, but, you know, there's always been that kind of Kevlar ceiling. When I went to the Defense Language Institute to learn Arabic, the male-to-female ratio is something like, I mean, don't quote me on this, I think it's like 8-1 or something. There are more females at DLI than males. But again, frequently when you look at the higher-ranking officers, when you look at people who really make it up to the upper echelon, even in enlisted ranks, not necessarily just officer ranks, frequently they're men. Frequently platoon leaders are men. Squad leaders are men. And in my intelligence unit, that's exactly what it was like. So even for something like, you know, linguistics, where it's proven that there are more women entering this field for whatever reason than there are men. There are more women at DLI than there are men. Still, when you look at who rises to the top and who, you know, gets pushed up the ranks a little bit faster, frequently it's men. I mean, that's not anything new and not anything surprising based on the history of the military, and that's certainly the way it was when I was a linguist. But that being said, I really loved my time in the military. I loved serving in Kuwait. I got, you know, the opportunity to really use my Arabic on the ground, to meet some other extraordinary linguists and other leaders, and even, you know, other male leaders as well while I was in the military. So great opportunity, but also this sort of clear difference in terms of how people are moved up.
There are many Arabic dialects. You had to learn to speak Arabic to be understood in Kuwait, which would have been different than if you'd been in Egypt or in Libya.
Exactly, right. So there's something called Modern Standard Arabic, which is what's used in news reports. If you flip on the TV and are listening to the news, you'll hear that in Modern Standard Arabic. If you pick up a newspaper, you'll read Modern Standard Arabic. But when you're on the ground talking to people, the dialects based on country and sometimes even region within country can be vastly different.
Ned, you also are a Spanish linguist, and you served in Central and South America?
I did, yeah. So I was in Ecuador and Honduras as well. I completed missions there, too.
Did you become a journalist right after you left the U.S. military?
You know, I kind of had this interesting foray into journalism. So when I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Maryland right away. I was kind of going back and forth between journalism and English. I sort of was leaning more toward the English major side, although I'd always loved journalism and kind of knew I wanted to do it. Then I left school. I had a lot of friends who were linguists, and I was very interested in languages and exploring that. And I thought, you know, the military would be a great way to do that. I took the language test, which the military offers. They picked the language for you. They picked Arabic for me based on how I scored on that test. But even when I was in the military, I kind of knew I wanted to go back to journalism. There was something in the back of my head that was kind of constantly tapping and saying, what about this over here? So while I was completing my military service, I started writing more. I started writing for the base newspaper. And then I took those clips and got a job at a local newspaper because I thought, well, I want to sort of try out this journalism thing full time. I've been a full-time linguist. I know what that's like, and I know that I love it. Let me go back to journalism a little bit and make sure I still love that. And I did. I jumped in. I won an award there for investigative reporting. That was the first full-time newspaper job I ever had, really. And then I knew I kind of wanted to go back to school and finish my journalism degree at that point. You know, working for a couple of years at a newspaper really helped me decide that.
And when you,
and so,
yeah,
sorry.
Go finish what you were saying.
Oh, no, so then I just re-enrolled at University of Maryland, returned, and enrolled in the J School this time instead of English, and, you know, finished my degree. So.
And when you were at the Washington Post, you covered a wide range of stories: government, crime, incarceration, the military, real estate, the metro and art section. So
right.
So this the things that this book and the film that you won an Emmy for come as a surprise because they really don't fit in with the stuff that you were doing at the Post.
Right. So when I was at the Post, I was actually I started at the Post while I was finishing up my journalism degree. So I was working full-time and going to school full-time. And then after I graduated, I became a copy editor, and then I also wrote for various sections of the paper. So I was writing anything and everything I possibly could because, like I said, I love to write, and I wanted to get as much experience doing that as possible. So when I came to USA Today, I left the Post in 2008 after Obama was elected, came to USA Today, and got this great opportunity to explore a lot of different things here as well. So I'm on the editorial board here, and I'm a digital content editor for the editorial page here. And so I think it sort of is a continuum. I mean, I was exploring a lot of different things to write while I was at the Washington Post. When I was at the newspaper in Augusta, Georgia, before I came back to school and back to the Washington Post, I was a general assignment reporter, and that's kind of what general assignment reporters do. You cover a little bit of everything. So I kind of thought of myself while I was at the Washington Post as being general assignment, covering everything I could get the chance to cover. And so when I came here, I, again, like I said, was on the editorial page, and then I also started a vertical for USA Today called Policing the USA, that kind of explores issues related to the justice system in America, to police conduct in America. And through that, I started a project where I visited prisons across the country to explore recidivism rates. And that project is what won an Emmy. So that was part of my work here at USA Today.
Don't almost all of the world's developed countries have lower recidivism rates than the United States?
They do.
Did you
we
discover
are one
why?
of the worst. Well, one thing that I noticed that's consistent here, that's not as consistent in other countries, is how much we lock people up for drug offenses. So we're kind of starting to rethink that with the opioid crisis, right? We're getting to the point where we're thinking, well, people have problems that, you know, are related to addiction that they can't necessarily help. This is a disease and people need medical treatment. They don't need to be locked up. But for so long in this country, the answer was they're committing a crime, lock them up, and the thought of giving treatment was kind of secondary. So you can't really lock people up like that and not necessarily make treatment the number one tool that's used to help them and not expect to get high recidivism rates. And so we spent decades doing that in this country, and that's one of the biggest reasons our recidivism rates are so much higher. So if you look at what happens in EU nations, in some countries in the EU, they don't even lock people up for drug use. They immediately send them to treatment. And often in other countries where they do, it's sort of like a kind of slap on the wrist. It's sort of like a little more symbolic, hey, you committed this crime, and perhaps the public is expecting us to take a disciplinary measure. So maybe the person will be locked up for a couple of months. But the main thing they try to do is route them to treatment as quickly as possible. So I think that's the biggest difference. And then often in this country, when people do get treatment, some of the treatment programs that exist within prisons are just really not great treatment programs. And so then they're sent back out into the community. Maybe they've had a little bit of treatment, not enough to keep them from the temptations that they knew before they got locked up, and then the cycle just kind of starts all over again. So that's the biggest difference that we saw.
But we have invited you on this show to talk about your book, Beyond the Call, 3 Women on the Front Lines of Afghanistan. My guest is Eileen Rivers. This is Leonard Lopate at Large. So let's talk about, the rest of the conversation will be pretty much about what's in the book. After you provide that brief history of women in the American military, you introduce your readers to Jamila Abbas. Who is she, and how did you learn about her?
So she has this incredible story. She is a woman who became a feminist in Afghanistan, which probably sounds counterintuitive because to a certain extent it is. I mean, this is a country where women are highly oppressed in large swaths of the country, not necessarily everywhere, but when you get to the rural parts of the country, very much so. And that's where she came from. She was raised in a rural section of Afghanistan. She ended up moving to Kabul, which is a city, very urban part of Afghanistan. But her and her husband were really fleeing insurgents and fleeing the Taliban. They spent so much time doing that. And her husband ended up getting killed by an insurgent group. And instead of that causing her shrink, that actually gave her strength. And so she turned that tragedy really into an opportunity to give other women in the country who are going through similar things a source of strength. And so she became this incredible feminist. She worked with Joanna Smoke, Captain Joanna Smoke, who was a FET leader. And I actually found her through Joanna. So I spent so much time trying to find a woman on the ground whose story I could tell, who had been affected by FET leadership in the FET program. And there are so many women that I knew about and tried to reach out to, and frequently in Afghanistan, women become afraid to tell their story. So there were women who were female police officers who had been attacked, who had to leave the profession because they'd been threatened. And I talked to a lot of women who had experienced that. And then when I said, okay, I want to tell your story in writing, they sort of tended to shrink away because that could mean danger for them. Well, Jamila was like, do it. Fine. Tell my story in writing. Because at that point, she really felt like she'd experienced the worst of it. Her husband had been killed right in front of her and her children. When I talked to her about that, she frequently said she felt kind of guilty about not ushering her children away really quickly. They were really young. Her youngest at that time was almost 2 years old. And I can imagine that she was so incredibly shocked when you see that happening right in front of you. You're not sure what to do. And so, you know, she was very candid about what she'd experienced in her life, and very candid about how these experiences made her stronger, and also about things that she, you know, felt like she should have done differently. But, of course, I certainly couldn't fault her for that. I can't imagine anybody faulting her for that.
How did the female empowerment teams actually come into being?
The female engagement teams, yeah. So
engagement teams. Didn't they grow out of another program called Team Lioness, which sounds to me to be a bit sexist?
Exactly. So in Iraq, actually, early on in the war in Iraq, there were units that were all men that were going into some of these incredibly strict Muslim villages trying to frisk, interrogate, gain information from the Iraqi women. And they were kind of realizing that they were potentially turning friendly villages into enemy villages. They were crossing all sorts of religious barriers, all sorts of cultural barriers. And then, you know, what they realized was we need women here to be able to talk to other women, frisk other women, gain intelligence that we are losing. For a while, they thought, okay, let's not cross these cultural barriers and just stop frisking these women. And they realized, well, we're losing all kinds of intelligence that could help us track down the Taliban. The Taliban kind of got wise to that game and started hiding information on the women. And so they started attaching teams of 2 to 3 women to these infantry units and sending them out on combat missions. And the first iteration of that, as you said, was called Team Lioness. And so these were women that didn't initially have any combat training. I mean, of course, everybody goes through basic training in the Army. But that doesn't necessarily give you infantry training. That doesn't prepare you to be on the front lines of battle at all. And so these were women who sort of bravely took on the missions, went to the front lines of battle and did the same thing they saw the men doing. I interviewed a woman who was on Team Lioness for this book, and she said, initially it was a bit crazy. We kind of, if we encountered fire, we did what the men did. If we saw them run, we ran. We had no idea what was going on to some extent. If we saw them pull out their weapon, we pulled out our weapon. When they stopped to frisk a man, we stopped to frisk a woman. They were really kind of feeling their way. It wasn't until much later that ISAF actually sent down essentially a directive that said women who, attach to these units, set teams have to be fully trained. And by that time, it had become ubiquitous. They were coming from all countries, all branches of service were using them.
But it's surprising that gender-based combat exclusion ended only very recently.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so these women had been on the ground, making all kinds of sacrifices, and the military was sort of saying, well, we know you're doing that, but we're still not fully recognizing you as combat soldiers. And they had to spend years kind of proving themselves over and over again. And that was frequently to their detriment. I mean, when it came to, again, getting promotions, you had mentioned that Kevlar ceiling, they were kind of caught in this catch-22 situation where they'd been in combat but hadn't been officially recognized as being in combat. And that was to the detriment of a lot of women.
Jamila Abbas, or Abbas, is it? She found allies in the female engagement teams, but you point out, ironically, the American women were themselves subject to rules that limited their roles.
Right. So because they weren't officially considered combat soldiers, they couldn't, for example, drive off of the FOB, the forward operating base. They had to either... and this was to complete their own mission. So there were two different missions that fat women were completing. On the one hand, they were completing combat missions. So whenever an infantry unit needed women to go with them to the front lines, women would attach to that unit and go. But the FET also had their own separate missions. So in addition to going into combat, they were doing things like nation building. They were helping women get microloans. They were going through villages, knocking on doors and saying, hi, we're female engagement teams, we're here. What is it that you need? How is your family living? What kind of progress have you made or not made since the beginning of the war? They were doing questionnaires like that. They were also helping to train women, so military police women, for example. They were training them so that they were prepared, the Afghan military police women, to take over once the American military police officers and American troops in general left the country. So these were all things that FET teams were tasked with doing outside of the combat mission. So when it came to doing their own missions, the FET missions, they were kind of limited. They couldn't drive off the base by themselves. Women were not allowed to do that. They sometimes had a hard time getting helicopters to go and complete missions. So they were, again, there was this catch-22 of, we want you to be on our combat teams. We know you have your own missions to complete, but that's kind of on the side. We'll get to that when we can get to that. And so that often ended up hampering them.
Yeah, didn't it often even put them in danger? Because since they, on the one hand, weren't allowed to stay in the field for extended periods of time, after spending days in the field with infantry units, they had to wait for a convoy to come through to hitch a ride back to the mission.
Correct.
So they actually were left more exposed than the men.
That's right. So every time you drive to and from a combat mission, obviously you're exposing yourself to more danger, potential IEDs, potential, guerrilla attacks from out of nowhere. And oftentimes women were exposed to that more because there was this rule that said, well, you're not really in combat. And that rule extended to, if you go out on a combat mission, you can only stay out in the field for so long because technically you're not in combat. Technically you're not supposed to be there for over a certain number of days. So to get around that rule, what we'll do is we'll send you out with the combat mission, and then after a couple of days, we'll drive you back to the forward operating base so that you can stay there overnight and then catch a ride again back out to the mission. So there were all of these kinds of really odd rules that put women in difficult positions. not being able to drive off the base by themselves, and then when they did go on missions, having to force them to come back to the FOB so that, you know, the official label of being in combat was never actually put on a woman, even though they were doing the same job. So there was that extra exposure to potential danger, driving back and forth, really for reasons that were unnecessary aside from this sort of outward appearance.
And you mentioned Sergeant Sheena Adams. She was caught up in this catch-22. She had to fight hard to get assigned to Afghanistan in the first place.
Right.
But wasn't she on her way to an information-gathering mission in a remote village in Helmand Province when her vehicle was destroyed by a Taliban IED?
Right.
Was she injured?
Yeah. She was. She actually suffers from TBI. She's had a couple of different operations because of that. So she was injured in that. Her entire unit was injured in that. That wasn't one of those cases where she was sent back and forth because of the combat exclusion rule. But her entire unit, their vehicle was hit by an IED, and so she actually passed out. She said she remembers all of these magazines. These magazines come in like these huge boxes, and these magazines fell on her Kevlar helmet and also fell on her legs and trapped her in the vehicle. And she remembers passing out, and then a few minutes later coming to, and then pushing all of these, you know, magazines off of her. And then the gunner in the vehicle was actually stuck and was really greatly injured. She remembered having this really painful headache, and then I think the adrenaline of the moment took over because right after they got out of the vehicle, they were attacked. So they were attacked by the Taliban. She had to immediately take a position, start firing back. This was, again, she was side by side with other men in her unit. They were all equally defending the unit. And then she remembered after it was over, this incredible pounding sensation came back again. And that ended up being a traumatic brain injury. She had swelling in her brain. She's had a couple of subsequent surgeries to kind of help her. She still suffers from memory lapses. During my interviews with her, occasionally I could sense that. I could feel the sort of memory lapse. Sometimes she might lose train of thought, or she might just start talking about something else, and you realize she's not quite with you. But, you know, still, she came back from Afghanistan, incredibly dynamic, trying to keep the FET program going, even though the fact that she'd been in it, again, made her hit that Kevlar ceiling we were talking about. She still saw its usefulness, its efficacy. She wanted to fight for it.
But wouldn't that experience have earned her a medal?
She did get medals, actually.
Oh,
she got, yes, she did.
Because you write she found her advancement was blocked because the system gave her no credit for combat service.
Right, and so it's kind of a tricky thing. She got credit in terms of getting medals, but then when it came to her getting promoted, her evaluation, when you're promoted, has to be on your job, and the FET wasn't officially her job. Her job was being a helicopter mechanic. So when she came back to her unit, when it came time for doing an evaluation, well, her commanders who were in her unit weren't with her on the ground in Afghanistan. She was attached to a different unit. So they couldn't really evaluate her on the work she did there, on top of the fact that that work wasn't her official MOS. It wasn't her official job. Her job was being a helicopter mechanic, which she hadn't done during all those months when she was in Afghanistan. So then how could she really be evaluated on that? This is really the horrible catch-22 that women were in. If a man goes to combat, he's still doing his official job. He's going there with a combat unit. He's getting evaluated on how he performs that job in the field. Women who were in FET units were not evaluated on that because it wasn't really their job. So she came back. She did have the paperwork to try to go before the promotions board. She was also out on maternity leave when she came back. Her and her husband decided to start a family. And so that paperwork somehow was lost. That would have gone before the promotions board. And she wasn't there to try to corral it and try to find it. And again, her evaluation likely wouldn't have been as high as, for example, a male soldier who had stayed in the unit and had continued to be a helicopter mechanic. So that could have also been a ding against her. So ultimately, she hit that Kevlar ceiling. She didn't go before the promotions board, and she cycled out of the military.
I'm speaking with Eileen Rivers, who's book is Beyond the Call, published by Da Capo, 3 Women on the Front Lines of Afghanistan. Eileen, how often can something like that happen?
How often can an American female soldier dance with a local Afghan
Yes,
man?
because many of the stories you tell are about separation of the sexes, not only in Afghan culture, but also, as it turns out, in the American military.
Right. And, that's an interesting question. I know that there were certainly differences in the way that Afghan men versus American military men perceived the ability of American women, American military women, and perceived how they should necessarily treat them. So I think of Maria Rodriguez when I think about that. According to her, even at the provincial governor's headquarters, there were certainly women who, worked side by side with Afghan men. Contact had to be limited outside of official work. Women weren't supposed to walk with Afghan men on the base by themselves. So there were definitely restrictions. But I always think, when I think about these things, that on some level, just kind of thinking about the relationship between, a lot of Afghan military men and the American women they were working with, oftentimes you're kind of fighting against years of, a certain way of thinking about the position of women in general on the part of Afghan men. And while there are rules that regulate how Afghan men are supposed to treat them, there's always going to be a little bit of a difference. So Maria Rodriguez, for example, said that when she met with the provincial governor, he wouldn't even shake her hand. When she was in those meetings with him, she was the only female in the room, and she was kind of sequestered off and kind of forced to sit away from the rest of the group. She didn't really speak during the meetings. She had to speak through her commanding officer. So she would write him notes if she had a question. She would pass the note to him, and he would present the question, not her. So there was certainly, and she was a major in the U.S. Army. She was a provost marshal. She was in charge of how detainees were held and treated. She was a military police officer. She was in charge of all the military police in her unit in Afghanistan. She was in charge of the canines. I mean, she had this huge responsibility in terms of what she did for the American military, but when it came to interacting with the Afghan provincial governor, for example, she wasn't necessarily treated with the same level of respect.
She was working. She was working to give Afghan policewomen the tools and training to fulfill their mission, but you're suggesting she didn't get much support from the Afghan government in doing that? Because she was a woman, or because they didn't want Afghan women to become police officers?
I think it was kind of a combination of both. I mean, I think on some level, the provincial governor, my impression was that he kind of, again, the years of thinking about women in a particular way, kind of looked at her perhaps as somebody who wasn't necessarily that high-ranking, or at least not worthy of how he would treat a male who walked into his office, who was a major, who was this high-ranking officer who had plenty to say, plenty to talk about in terms of training. The difference would have been stark. And then I think part of it was that you're absolutely right in terms of Afghan female police officers. They weren't necessarily getting the training at all before the female engagement teams came along. So part of what Maria Rodriguez was fighting to do was find out. She'd heard that there were about 6 women on the provincial governor's compound, and her mission was to find out where these women were, to train them up as much as she could, and again, to prepare them to take over when her FET team left. And so it took her several meetings, A, to be acknowledged by the provincial governor, and then B, to finally get the chance to ask about where these women were. And it turns out that they were in an office in the same building, kind of being sequestered, not working at all, not doing much of anything. And that's where she found them. And then she started training them.
The third woman you write about is Captain Johanna Smoke. She was placed in a Women in the Army study instead of her original Special Forces placement. And you write that this kind of force placement happened throughout the Army to test whether women were fit for combat, even long after the formation of Team Lioness.
Correct, yeah. So when she got that message, she got that email saying, you're going to this WIDA program instead of going to Special Forces, her first thought was, well, where was WIDA when I went to Iraq? This was after she had already served in Iraq and come back, and she was expecting to be able to get this Special Forces placement. So it was long after, Team Lioness, long after FETs had already been on the ground. And, again, her first thought was, I've been in Iraq. I have been attached to a male unit. It did not affect combat readiness. I successfully carried out all of my missions. But this was also the time when the Pentagon began thinking, okay, maybe we need to officially make it official that we're opening these combat roles to women, even though women have been doing this and the public hasn't necessarily known about it. So in order to do that, we need some kind of documentation. We need to show that we've studied this so that we can have proof of concept and present it to the public and say, yes, this actually works. And I guess the thinking was anecdotes about women on the ground aren't enough, or men who were, whose minds were really turned around by what FET teams were doing when they attached to their units. There are plenty of men I spoke to who said these FET teams were absolutely amazing in terms of the information they were able to gather. They were just as tough as we were on the ground. But again, the Army is, the Pentagon is thinking, well, now we're going to make this official. We're going to tell the public what we're doing. So we need some kind of proof of concept. We need a record to show, yes, we've actually studied this, and we can say, here's how women either do or do not affect readiness.
They were afraid that the public might be upset if women were given equal roles in the military?
I think the military often moves with caution and a lot of paperwork.
Does it matter who's in the White House? Is policy affected on that level, or is this pretty much a Pentagon thing?
I think a lot of it is really a Pentagon thing. WIDA existed long before the idea of opening combat roles to women started. WIDA has studied, going back decades, a lot of the transitions women have made. So there were studies that were done, for example, when basic training units decided to become gender integrated. I was in one of the first basic training units where that actually happened. But even before gender integration started in basic training in the Army, there were all these studies that were done to show, will this affect readiness? So let's study units that are all men and then study units that are gender integrated before we officially say, okay, women can handle this and we're going to do it. So I don't know that it necessarily matters who's in office. I think, again, it's this military concept of, even if it's already happening, somehow we can't officially recognize it. And then when we do, we have to sort of jump through all of these hoops to make sure we have the paperwork to say, okay, it can happen.
Now, talking about Captain Smoke brings us back to Jamila Abbas. How did she become Jamila Abbas's chief of staff?
Right. That was sort of the nickname she gave herself. So Jamila Abbas became her partner. Often women, FET teams, when we talk about that FET-only mission versus the FET combat mission, they're partnered with Afghan women who may need assistance, who may perform an official government role. And Jamila actually did perform an official government role. She was the leader of a women's center, and that women's center provided services for Afghan women in terms of education, economic empowerment. And so Joanna Smoke partnered with Jamila to help provide anything that she might need in order for Jamila to carry out her own mission. And, it turns out that Jamila needed quite a lot. Again, she had become this feminist, so in addition to doing all of these government-sanctioned things, she was trying to register Afghan women to vote. She was also helping some Afghan women leave their husbands if they were caught in an oppressive or abusive relationship. She was helping Afghan girls to escape child marriage in some cases. And so the Taliban observed this, other insurgent groups observed this, and they didn't like it. So Jamila's Women's Center was bombed actually 3 times. It was bombed once before Joanna Smoke showed up. The first time she met Jamila was on this Women's Center compound that had been recently bombed by insurgents, and she helped her rebuild it. And so she started nicknaming herself Jamila's chief of staff because she said, I'm here to do whatever Jamila needs me to do in order to make the lives of women better in Afghanistan. And they ended up accomplishing so much together, doing exactly that. They were a great team.
But the Taliban weren't only the ones killing women who worked outside the home and started asking for women's rights. In some conservative rural areas, didn't males also threaten and kill their female relatives? Women who took on male-dominated professions were called sluts?
Yes. So unfortunately, that happened to some of the military police officers that Maria Rodriguez was working with. And there's just case after case of other women who come forward, for example, and try to run for parliament. Something just as an aside, I'm reminded of something that happened a few weeks ago, a woman running for parliament who had a rally in Kabul, and insurgents bombed the rally and killed 14 people. That's still happening today. But the military police officers that Maria Rodriguez worked with were very much threatened. People would call the police station and threaten to kill them if they didn't quit, threaten to behead them if they didn't quit, threaten their family members. They were called all kinds of names, as you mentioned. So the idea of a woman working in a lot of these rural areas, and keep in mind this is Zabul, which is further south in the country and very rural. You're right. It's not just the Taliban. It's also husbands, it's brothers, it's fathers threatening to kill female family members or other women in their villages if they work, and especially if they become police officers.
What role did the women in the female engagement teams play in gathering information and intelligence? Mm-hmm. They could speak to women when often American male soldiers would not be allowed to?
Absolutely. So that was one of the primary reasons that these teams started, was so that women could, on a mission, frisk other women, Afghan women. So there was this kind of contradiction to some extent in terms of their interaction with Afghan women. I mean, I would often talk to Joanna Smoke about this, and she would say, you're absolutely right. On the one hand, we're there to help and boost and protect women. We get microloans for them. For example, Joanna Smoke got a microloan for Jamila to support the Women's Center.
Now, the
microloans,
of it the microloans allowed these women to start their own businesses and sell stuff in the markets?
Right. So for some of the women, the microloans were about starting a business so they could support their family and bring money into the household. For Jamila, a grant. She actually got a grant, not a microloan. The grant she got was about helping her to rebuild the Women's Center. So there was that side of it that was all about boosting and empowering women. And the other side of it, this combat mission, was about trying to gain intelligence from women, trying to get information from women. So they would, in addition to frisking them, sometimes just have conversations with them that may seem like casual conversations on some level, but really what they're trying to do is gain information about Taliban activity that might be in the area. And often women knew this. I mean, they wanted to protect their sons. They saw their sons or their neighbors' children being recruited by insurgent forces. And so frequently they wanted to talk to female engagement teams about what could have been happening in their local village that kind of may have clued Afghan women that, insurgents might be recruiting, because they wanted to protect their sons, and they knew that female engagement teams could help them do that. But the frisking was always a little bit difficult for female engagement teams. I mean, they did it because they knew that was their duty and they had to, but, they wanted to help and empower and boost as much, if not more, than doing the other stuff, the intelligence collection.
What were they looking for when they were frisking these women?
Anything that could clue them in on what an insurgent group was about to do. So sometimes they may have found cell phone SIM cards. They may have found, plots written out on sheets of paper with addresses that were, tucked into a woman's dress strap, for example. They could have found all kinds of information, maps, that they would then bag, tag, and pass on to the intelligence unit. So, anything that they could pass along that could give anybody investigating what the insurgents were doing a clue as to what might be coming up, they would pass along. And that also counted for conversation. If they were having a casual conversation about why the market was incredibly quiet that day, that could give them a clue that perhaps there's nobody there because they've been tipped off that the Taliban or some other insurgent group planted a bomb or had planned to attack. So a lot of conversations, aside from, frisking, just general conversations, could give clues as to what could be being planned.
And you write that when men in the American combat units saw how well these techniques worked, they started using them to relate to Afghan men?
Exactly, yeah. So one of the techniques that women use that perhaps combat units hadn't necessarily tried as much before was really relationship building. I mean, trying to listen, not necessarily interrogate, but have a conversation so that people built a rapport and built a sense of trust so that they then would want to come and talk to you. And that wasn't necessarily something that combat units had tried. So often the approach was one of interrogation, not necessarily one of, I want to build a relationship with this person and build a sense of trust, and then the information will come. It was kind of like, let me try to get as much information as possible off the top. And I think seeing said teams in action often clued infantry units into a different approach, and one that was often more effective.
You note that not every battle for the women of the FET was fought abroad. What kinds of fights followed them after their tours and pushed them into action at home?
So, part of what women are bringing back, since they're on the front lines more than they were before, are some of the same injuries and mental health issues that men have been fighting for years, but I think the military hasn't necessarily been as prepared for it in women.
They're not being treated for PTSD?
They are, but sometimes I think the struggle for women is a bit different in terms of treatment, and there has to be this kind of balance. So, for example, there were a lot of women who were dealing with pregnancy and PTSD at the same time. That's not necessarily an issue that the military encountered before. Or the VA hospital encountered before. So I think the VA hospital especially is trying to create, these groups that cater specifically to the needs of women dealing with issues that in previous wars haven't necessarily been issues. So those are definitely things that are different for the military to deal with and for the VA to deal with, and that are very unique to the female struggle coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Would you say that your own experiences as a woman in the military gave you a unique perspective on what these soldiers faced?
I think it definitely gave me a perspective that made me want to hear more directly in my reporting from the soldiers themselves. So part of what prompted me to start this, to write this book, was a project that I started for USA Today. In a lot of reporting, I realized that some of it wasn't as dynamic as I thought it could be based on my own military experience. And so I thought, well, why not hear from people directly on the ground who are on the front lines? I mean, nowadays, everybody is a documentarian. Everybody's a photographer. We all have these little devices called smartphones, and we can create a documentary and post it on YouTube. We can take photos and post them on our own social media channels and kind of create our own magazines about whatever's happening in our lives. And so I thought, why not get the stories from soldiers who are on the front lines and have no filter? And so I put out a call to action and said, send me your photos. If you're on the front lines, Send me your photos, send me your videos, show me what you're experiencing. And we got an onslaught of photos. And I think having been in the military and knowing that there was a more dynamic experience that I wasn't seeing covered prompted me to do that. I think that experience definitely kind of made my approach to this book and my approach for what I did for USA Today probably different than what's been seen before.
I suspect you also experienced some of the mixed messages that the U.S. military has been sending out. These women in the military marched under heat with 40-pound rucksacks on their backs. They've fired M16s out of the windows of military vehicles. They defended the units in deadly firefights, and they did things that their male counterparts could never do, like gathering intelligence on the Taliban from the women of Afghanistan, and yet they still weren't treated as complete equals. Do you think that women will ever be able to get past sexism in the military? Is it built into the military mindset? Well, I think it's definitely better now in terms of getting over that than it has been before. There's such a kind of good old boys network feel to a lot of what happens in the military. I don't know if we'll ever completely get beyond that. I hope that we will. But I think that there will be more struggles in terms of women actually proving, yes, this was open to me, and yes, as a woman, I completed the same exact skill set, no matter how tough, as the men did. I mean, we saw that happening when women went into Army Ranger School, the first 3 women to graduate. At almost every step, their credentials were challenged. The idea that they were doing all of these obstacles and meeting all the physical standards that the men met, they did all of that. Yet while they were in the process of doing it, there were people on social media questioning whether the standards had been changed. There was actually a congressman questioning whether the standards had been changed. So I think now the challenge is, yes, it's been open to women, but there are still going to be people doubting whether women actually make the standards. And so we just need sort of that long-haul perspective of, we're here, we're doing it, we're meeting the standards, and eventually people will see that. And I think that's the push in the fight now. Do you think that the fact that a number of women who have served in the military are now running for Congress? Locally here in New Jersey, we have Mikey Sherrill, who was a naval officer, worked a helicopter pilot who's running for Congress. Is that where some of the push has to come from? I think absolutely that helps. That's an incredible point. I mean, we need, obviously, more women in Congress, and I love the fact that there are so many women who are running. There are potentially, historical strides being made with Stacey Abrams, for example, if she wins in Georgia. That's a governor's race. There are women who are moving up in all areas of politics in the U.S. now. And I think that's incredible, and I think you're right. I think that's part of it. The fact that we have women who are veterans, running for Congress, I think is incredible, and I think they can certainly push the message. What response have you gotten from this book? Well, the book is just being published now, but have you gotten any feedback yet? Yeah, I've certainly heard from women who are veterans who are so enthusiastic that their stories are being told, and also heard from women who are interested in studying feminism, women's equality, who are studying, the push for gender equality in the military as well. So the feedback has been incredibly positive from so many different fronts. I think this is a book that kind of meets people where they are in different areas. If you're interested in military history, if you're interested in gender rights and equality. The feedback has been in so many different areas incredibly positive. Eileen Rivers is a USA Today editor and editorial board member, and she is an Emmy Award winner as well, and now the author of Beyond the Call, 3 Women on the Front Lines in Afghanistan. It's published by Da Capo. Thank you so much for being on our show today. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. I appreciate the opportunity. And that brings us to the end of our show today. My great thanks to Eileen Rivers, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my producer, Jesse Lent, who helps make things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.